absolute declaration of war.
Yeah, but who would that be against?
Well, Osama bin Laden.
Declare war on somebody. You declare a war on this one man?
Well, in fact, it's been done before. The third president of the United States, with the acquiescence of the Fifth Congress, declared war against the Barbary pirates, who were terrorists. And of course, what we have now is the 43rd president, the 107th Congress, and there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says you can't declare war against Osama bin Laden. Further to that, it is not only the Taliban who have provided refuge to him, but also, when one looks at it, in neighboring Turkmenistan, this man has been given at least acquiescence, if not refuge. And so I know that people are looking there as well as Afghanistan.
Ollie North, very interesting stuff. Thank you very much. Hope you'll come back. Let's turn now to another person who served in the Reagan administration who might have some thoughts on what the diplomatic implications might be of the kind of declaration of war that's being kicked around here in Washington and about which Oliver North just spoke. I'm speaking of George Shultz, who was President Reagan's Secretary of State, who is now at the Hoover Institution. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Give us your sense of what you've been hearing.
The President spoke briefly, but very powerfully. And one should listen carefully to what he said. He used the word war. This attack on us was an act of war, just as the attack on the Cole was an act of war. And the attack on the Pentagon, a military place, was accompanied by attacks on civilians designed to terrorize. But these are acts of war, and I was glad to hear the President use that word.
And how would you like to...
The second thing he said, that he said many things, but the second thing I want to underline is something you mentioned earlier in your program, namely that those responsible are the people who carried out the act, who helped plan it, who helped finance it, who provided a safe haven, a place where people could make their plans and so on. In other words, a country that allows people to make plans like this is to be held responsible. Now, what do we do? Well, of course, first of all, we look to the people who have been so badly harmed directly, and we do everything we can to help. And I must say, in watching what's happening in New York, the people of New York and the mayor and the governor are doing a great job there. So we do that. But we have to really turn our intelligence on to find where this is coming from. Not only to retaliate justice, but to prevent further things from happening. We need to preempt when we see something that's happening. Now, whoever planned this is well organized and is capable of daring and innovation. I've heard lots of talks about terrorist activities and war activities. I've never heard of anybody having the imagination to conceive of using a commercial airliner as a bomb. So I don't think we should take precautions in airports and so on, but you shouldn't necessarily assume that the next thing the person who is warring on us does is a replica of what just happened. There are many other things, and so we have to really dig in, and we have to be ready to eliminate the source of this.
All right, now, Mr. Secretary, if you're talking about eliminating the source of this, that would seem to suggest military action by the United States.
Absolutely.
Acts of war by us. A, do we need a declaration of war? And B, if we get one, and it is against Osama bin Laden and his collaborators of one kind or another, should military strikes be carried out against states, Afghanistan for one, others?
We need to put people on notice that if they harbor terrorists, they are going to get it from us. No place to hide.
And should there, but having put them on notice,
then you follow through. I remember indelibly in my mind when I was in the boot camp in the U.S. Marine Corps, and a sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, "Here, this is your best friend. Take good care of it, and remember, never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. So no empty threats, but when we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it.
All right. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, thank you very much for your reflections, sir. It's nice to have you. All right. Now, in a moment here, we're going to do a recap here for local stations. And I'm sorry? All right. So let's go back to Shepard Smith in New York. Shep?
All right, Britt, thanks very much. We have former police commissioner in New York City, Howard Safir, who's here with us. He's been down to the war zone, as it's now being called, in Lower Manhattan. We'll hear from him about what's going on there and the loss of lives in just a moment. But first, our Fox stations join us. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. This is Fox News continuing coverage of attack on New York and Washington. Let's go straight to downtown Manhattan, where the rescue work is now underway. President Bush saying tonight that thousands have lost their lives. These are live pictures over the Manhattan skyline. All of Lower Manhattan dark this night. The gas shut off in town. Rescue workers standing by. The West Side Highway said to be loaded up with ambulances waiting to make their way into the lower end, the financial district of this city. Over to the left side would be the Empire State Building, which is lit up each night in different colors. Tonight, the Empire State Building is dark, New York City and the world in mourning. This is a live look over the skyline of New York. The familiar Twin Towers on the southern end are gone, will never be seen again, and beneath what's left of them, thousands of people believed to be buried alive and some dead. Today, a jumbo jet, a pair of them, slammed straight into what were the World Trade Center. The first coming just about 9 o'clock this morning, this second one just minutes later, in one side and out the other. And an enormous fireball. A plane turns to bomb, loaded with fuel, ready to go cross-country. That explosion in the middle of the building, people seen jumping to their deaths in the middle of the fire, and eventually, minutes later, the two towers of the World Trade Center collapsing to the ground. Tonight, there are volunteers there and in Washington, D.C., where the Pentagon was also a target. Today, a jet coming from Dulles Airport, leaving that airport almost immediately hijacked. After a trip due west, it circled back, and according to Washington Post reports, it was headed directly for the White House until it made a quick circle and then veered around and came barreling into the side of the Pentagon. And these are the first up-close pictures of the Pentagon as released from pool video late this afternoon and into this evening. The fire said to be still burning even at this hour on the inner ring. They are still working to account for all those who may have been missing, and it's a much larger task in New York. At 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning on 9/11, 50,000 people should be working in the World Trade Center. In the minutes after it happened, the New York City Bomb Squad, one of the first to get there and many of New York City's bravest, at the foot of that particular building, and now hundreds of people are dead there. Former Police Commissioner Howard Safir is with us. You've been down there. Describe it for us if you can.
It's a war zone. It's a barbaric act of war, and many brave firefighters and police officers have lost their lives, as well as countless innocent civilians. And this is a situation where tonight and for the next few days this will be a rescue operation, and then sadly it'll turn into a recovery operation.
It's my understanding that the bomb squad and many of the fire department were able to get there in a matter of minutes, which is surprising in no way, that there were dozens of fire trucks at the foot of that building when the first center collapsed.
There were dozens of firefighters and police officers. The average response time in this town to a fire is under 4 minutes. I'm sure they were there in under 3, and when that building collapsed, it was just pure carnage.
There have been warnings now. I get the impression, at least, that those within the city and the government of the city, though they're not coming to the microphones to say it, they're leaking around the sides, that tomorrow is going to offer some awful scenes down there, and that this city will change in tone, that this mourning will eventually become anger, and there are fears. Can this city be kept under control in the worst of circumstances?
This is a resilient city full of wonderful people, and it will be kept under control. But the anger is anger that's real anger, and it should be demonstrated in our response to this terrorist act.
In looking at all of that down there, is there a way for this city to ever be quite what it was before? Or will our lives change, in your estimation, to a degree which we maybe can't even consider now?
Our lives can never be the same because of the brave people that have been lost in this city and the innocent civilians. But this is a resilient city, and it will build, and on that site of that World Trade Center, I'm sure will rise great buildings again. But this is a city that has come of age in a very bizarre, strange way today, and it's a city that is going to want accountability for this act of terrorism.
110 stories reduced to rubble in the southern end of Manhattan this night. They are asking for help from across the nation. President Bush saying now that thousands are believed to be dead. That number could go in excess of 10,000. Dozens killed in Washington as well. 4 plane loads, that is, of brave Americans all went down as part of this terrorist attack. I'm Shepard Smith in New York, continuing coverage on the Fox News Channel on cable. United States Capitol, flags at half-mast at 30 minutes past 9 o'clock in the evening. The United States in mourning, looking to find out who's responsible for what is now being considered the worst act of terror in the history of the world. A live look now in southern Manhattan as the rescue crews are out, New York's finest and New York's bravest, working to pull those who may have survived this carnage from the wreckage. You may notice to the left and right, all the lights are out, all the gas is shut off. Lower Manhattan is dark this night, but the best news is there is calm in America's largest city, a quiet pale over this town as hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people looked to the sky throughout the day and wondered how such a disaster could happen, how there could be so much hate to send thousands and thousands of people to a death that's almost unimaginable. I'm Shepard Smith in New York, continuing coverage from here coming. First, let's go back to Britt Hume in Washington. Britt.
Shep, thanks very much. Joining us in our studios here in Washington tonight is former UN Secretary Bill Richardson, former Energy Secretary Bill Richardson as well. Mr. Secretary, you've experienced crises from within the halls of government and on Capitol Hill. Give us your sense of the response that we've heard from this administration and from the leaders on Capitol Hill this day.
Well, I thought the president was right on the mark. He had to reassure the country that we would respond aggressively. He had to comfort the country, show that there's been normalcy. I think the fact that his cabinet was out there basically indicating that we're not going to be terrorized by terrorists, that the work of the nation is going to continue, that the economy and airports are going to open. I think the Congress showed unity here. I think what is very important now, Britt, is that after we conclude the healing and the mourning of loss of a lot of people, and after we assess what happened and find who the perpetrators are, we have to figure out our response. And I think our response has to be swift, strong. I believe that we should recognize that the biggest threat to Americans now is terrorism. It's not necessarily missiles from Russia or North Korea. It's terrorism. It's this disguised enemy that can strike at any time, and we need to be prepared.
All right. Now, you heard Oliver North saying in here earlier that you remember that the United States declared war on the Barbary pirates, who were, after all, terrorists of a kind. What about a declaration of war against the terrorists responsible for this? What about a declaration of war against Osama bin Laden, if the evidence continues to point, as it seems to now, to him and his organization as responsible, as indeed the only parties who probably could be responsible for such an attack?
Well, Britt, when I was at the UN, I went to Afghanistan to talk to the Taliban to try to get Osama bin Laden extradited. I didn't succeed, obviously, 4 years ago. But what is clear is that there's a new policy which I think makes sense, and that is that if he is being harbored, Osama bin Laden, by the Taliban, by other states, that those states are responsible too. And what we need to do in our response is not just go after the perpetrators, but destroy their networks, be systematic about it. And this is what is needed mostly. First-rate intelligence on where they are, human intelligence, spying. We need to do more of that. The satellite investments we've made are good. They provide intercepts of conversations, but unless we penetrate these terrorism cells, and unless we go out there with a massive effort at trying to deter something like this happening again by dramatically improving our human intelligence, we're going to be vulnerable again.
The president said, and I quote, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." Well, the Taliban certainly qualifies as those who harbor them. Should we attack the Taliban?
Yes, if they don't turn over Osama bin Laden, if he is being harbored there, they should be put on notice by a date certain. They will get a military response. Yes, I think that's a change in policy. Under the circumstances, I would support it, and I would hope that the president would be supported here on a bipartisan basis.
Secretary Bill Richardson, nice to have you, sir. Thank you very much. Let's go out to the Pentagon, or get a report from what's happening out at the Pentagon from our correspondent, Brian Wilson. The fire continues to burn. We've seen flames tonight. Brian, how's the firefight going?
Yes. Well, they still have a struggle going on here outside the Pentagon. As you know, they've been fighting a fire throughout the evening. It's traveling. If you've ever seen a big building fire, often one of the most stubborn things to put out is the fire underneath a metal roof or a long-running roof, and they're still struggling with that tonight. Ever so often we see flames jumping out from underneath the roof. They peel back the roof material, they put it out, then a few feet later it springs up again. I would say that fire has traveled under the roof 75 yards one direction from the impact zone and about 100 yards the other. We have earlier this evening some pictures that were taken by pool cameras that give us our first glimpse of the real damage up close. These are the closest pictures we've been allowed to see, and for the first time we're beginning to see the recovery of the bodies covered up on the ground, and the damage to this structure. You know, there are 5 rings to the Pentagon, the A through E. This plane was in a nosedive full throttle and went through E, D, and part of C. And the death count here is hard to tell. There were people, of course, aboard the plane, but we're having a hard time getting a firm number of who might have been in that part of the Pentagon when this impact occurred. So the cleanup continues. It will take some time. We are at ThreatCon Delta in this country. All military worldwide standing by at the highest state of alert. Washington, D.C. is under a military air cap. That is, there are aircraft patrolling the skies over Washington, D.C. To make sure that there are no other planes that are not accounted for. So here at the Pentagon, work continues, even though the fire continues and the cleanup continues. Deep within the belly of this building, they are still operating and directing the actions of the military. Britt?
Brian, have they given you any estimate as to, I mean, we had heard earlier that the fire had been basically contained, and of course, as we know, the building continued to operate. Our correspondents have been able to operate from inside. We heard a briefing by the Secretary of Defense from inside the building there. Obviously, that gives us some sense of the dimensions of the building, but have officials out there been able to give you any estimate as when they may have this fire actually under control and indeed put out?
No, I would say that the vast majority of the fire is under control. It's just these little hot spots that keep flaring up underneath the roof that are causing them trouble. It is a massive building, Britt, as you know, and in fact, it's so massive that one side is hit by an aircraft, and people on the far side hardly knew anything had happened here. That's incredible. They built this building the old-fashioned way with a lot of brick and a lot of mortar and a lot of granite. So it's a very, very substantial building.
All right, Brian Wilson, thank you very much. Well, that about gives you a sense of it from here. The president has spoken. He is back in the White House, where he will stay the night. Members of his administration are on their way back. Secretary Powell is on his way back and will be here and on duty in Washington tomorrow. He was in Colombia. His FEMA director, Joe Albaugh, was out in Montana. He's back and will be taking charge of the directing the government's response in terms of rescue, recovery, assistance to places where the damage has been so severe. And so the government has tried to portray itself this evening, I think, as prepared, functioning, and non-terrorized. Let's go back to New York and Shepard Smith.
Britt Hume, thanks very much. Remember standing at the foot of the Oklahoma City Federal Building in the hours after that explosion. This a building that is 1/10 the height, or less even, than the World Trade Center's 2 towers, yet it took them days and days and days just to remove enough rubble to find the people under there. Former Police Commissioner Howard Safer is with us. Commissioner, this could go on for weeks.
Could go on for weeks. The president has ordered the 8 urban search and rescue teams, which, as you know, worked in Oklahoma, into New York. We have one here in New York. And These are teams with specially trained dogs, special equipment, and they're going to have to meticulously move every bit of rubble to make sure that anybody possibly alive in that building is given an opportunity to be rescued. And that's going to be a painstaking, week-by-week process.
These people will be in tomorrow, I'm guessing. I know there's one from Miami-Dade County down in Florida. There's one from Dallas. They're specially trained for this sort of thing and fly in from all over the country.
Right, and the closest one I believe is Fairfax, Virginia. They'll be in here. We have our own here, and they'll be working. And this is a very painstaking process, but one that has recovered and saved many lives, and hopefully they'll be able to find people within the rubble right now.
There's a limit to how long a search and rescue effort can go on, though.
There is, and after a few days it becomes a recovery effort. And we just hope that the rescue effort moves quickly and we can save some lives.
200 firefighters missing and presumed dead, 78 of New York's police officers missing and presumed dead, including what amounts to the entire bomb squad. It's going to be tough on those men and women in the days to come.
This is going to be devastating to both departments. Having been fire commissioner before I was police commissioner, my heart goes out to them and their families, and I know what a close-knit group both the bravest and finest are, and this is going to be devastating to both organizations.
The National Guard on the way in, the U.S. military sending in aircraft carriers going to be in New York Harbor as soon as possible. The men and women out there working now will be working 24 hours a day till they get their backup, I suppose.
We're going to have to keep rotating people in and out because this is exhausting work, both physically and emotionally.
The cycle of emotion with these sorts of things is so well documented that I know your police officers even train knowing what that cycle is, and seeing a few of them on the streets today in stunned horror, looking up as we all watched for hours on end, that thing just smoking and smoking, and the police realizing that it's going to be a different scene in a couple of days. There's nothing you can do about it.
It is, and it's very frustrating because these men and women are dedicated to saving lives, and when they can't do anything about it, it really devastates them.
Will we have to lock the place down? What will have to happen to maintain order in this town?
Well,
Lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan is going to be closed tomorrow from 14th Street down to the Battery, and is going to be a rescue operation and to facilitate emergency vehicles getting in and out of there. It's going to take hundreds of ambulances, lots of heavy equipment, so it's going to be necessary to just keep the public out of there until this is done.
For people who visited Manhattan, he's talking about an enormous area. 14th Street is Union Square, if you know the area at all, and as you move south from there, all of Soho, Tribeca, the financial district, nothing, no movement, no markets tomorrow. The ramifications are overwhelming when you put them all down together.
Well, this is an unprecedented act, and the ramifications are overwhelming, but I think what you'll see in the next few days is that frozen zone will get smaller and smaller towards the World Trade Center so that the market opens and things get back relatively to normal.
One of the things that may have saved a lot of lives today is the fact that the first tower was hit, then the second tower was hit a short time later, but there was time for a lot of evacuating to happen before either of those buildings collapsed. Imagine being on the 92nd floor. We spoke earlier with a woman who was right there and made her way down and got away from the place before it collapsed. And then down at the bottom, a man named Bill Belmont, who was standing there as it all came crashing down. He's on the roof of our building here, the 46th floor of the News Corporation building in Midtown Manhattan. Bill, how you doing?
How are you?
I take us back, if you can, and as you looked up and suddenly everything changed.
Well, you know, when I got there, it was after the two planes had already hit, and perimeter was set up, and then I was looking for the command post.
I want to interrupt you for just a second because clearly we're having an audio problem there. Maybe they could raise his microphone a little bit higher. It's really noisy up there as our air conditioning units are running. Raise his microphone up, and we'll get back there in just a little while. The psychological help that's going to be necessary for the tens of thousands of people who witnessed something out of the blue that they never even dreamed of. There's going to be an enormous cry for that as well.
There will be, and all of the emergency personnel will go through counseling and will be debriefed and given counseling to help them get through what is a traumatic and really life-changing situation. When you see the kind of carnage that they're going to see in the next few days, it's something they're going to really need help with.
More than 500,000 people live and work in the area about which you were just speaking. 500,000. Are those people going to be able to get in and out of the city tomorrow bridges and tunnels, or what are people going to be able to maneuver?
Well, the city's going to be open tomorrow except from 14th Street South, and they'll be able to get in and out, but it's going to be a problem. And as the mayor said, and it's something that people ought to pay attention to, which is if you don't have to come to work tomorrow, treat it like a snow day. Stay home if you can.
It certainly looks like a snow day in southern Manhattan today, and lower Manhattan with 6 inches of ash still covering everything. Bill Belmont saw it all. Bill, I think we got some of the audio problems worked out.
Is that better?
And much better.
I just got a lot of the soot in my throat, so I'm going to talk up now.
Sure, I understand. Take us back to that moment.
Well, first, like I said, when I got there, investigative attorney with Pinkerton Consulting, we do crisis management, and we were trying to get to the command center to see if we can assist in what was done. It seemed that the command center was put over at Battery Park. So I had worked my way to the west side of the building. And there's a pedestrian overpass that goes from Battery